So good afternoon, everyone out there in internet land. Today here in Binghamton, New York, where I don't live because I live in Shenango Bridge, but it's close to Binghamton, and the post office says you live in Binghamton, so I go with it. It's actually not bad. It's very cloudy, but it went up from 7 degrees yesterday to 34 degrees today. So the dog is itching to get out, Andrew. So the dog may be poking her head in here saying, come on, hurry this up. Today on Smart Conversations with Yvonne DeVita, I have a guest, Andrew Allemann. Andrew Allemann, who's going to talk about podcasting. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Very delighted to have you on. I have been a member of Podcast Guests for a while, and this is one of the reasons that I wanted to have Andrew on. Andrew Allemann is the founder of PodcastGuests.com, and it's a service that connects podcasters with guests for their shows. There you go.
That's right. Nice and simple, right?
Yeah, easy, right? Over 30,000 people use the service to get booked or find guests. And I find both of those, Andrew, when I'm in there, very useful.
Excellent.
Whether to have someone on the show or to be on someone's podcast. So we're going to talk some more about that. And Andrew, the first thing I would like to ask you is why? What's that? You woke up one day and said, I'm going to start something called Podcast Guests.
So I'm a podcaster myself. I have a podcast about domain names of all things. So a very niche podcast. And after about a year of doing it, it was a guest format show, like a lot of podcasts. And after about a year, I was struggling to find more people in my Rolodex that make good guests for the show. And so I looked out there to see if there was some sort of service that could help me. And there were a handful of agencies that would help you find guests, but they're very expensive. And so I figured there has to be a free or inexpensive way to do this. And when I couldn't find it, I decided to create it for myself because I had a need. And I started asking other podcasters, and they said, yes, this would be very helpful. And so it started very small, and it grew quickly because there was definitely a need for this.
Well, absolutely. I mean, a need for it that goes without saying, because podcasting has really grown in the last 5 years. I'm going to tell you that I am one of the original business bloggers. So I was blogging back in 2004 before it became a big popular.
I started my blog in 2005. So yeah, that was definitely early.
Yeah. And podcasting, I mean, people launched podcasts, but they weren't as popular. And I've just seen in the last 3 or 4 years, it's just exploded. Why is it so much more popular now than it was then?
Well, it has become more popular in part because, Apple really helped by putting the Apple Podcast app on all iPhones and other iOS devices. So that really drove some interest to it. And then the quality of podcasts started getting better. There were some new and interesting shows that became popular. But then really, I was about to say last year now, I guess we're coming up on 2 years in the pandemic. So a couple of years ago, when the pandemic hit, I think people realized that they were lacking that one-to-one conversation, that in-depth conversation. And a lot of people said, hey, I can't go to trade shows anymore, or conferences to have these in-depth conversations. How can I replicate that online? And podcasts became a great way to do that. We also saw virtual events, of course, take off at the same time, but that really catapulted podcasting into the mainstream. And there was a lot more interest starting when the pandemic really took hold.
So when you launched Podcast Guests, were you prepared for the diversity of podcasts that showed up?
Yeah, so that was back in 2016. And I guess as someone who has a podcast about domain names, I expect a lot of diversity and niche shows out there. And so that's part of what I love about it, right? I mean, you can have a podcast about anything you want, and there's an audience for it. In fact, sometimes the more narrow your topic, the more excited that audience is, right? Because, they can't get that information anywhere else. And so I see both a lot of diversity in the types of podcasts that are out there, as well as in the types of guests. I'm always surprised when someone's like, yeah, I'm looking for B movie stars from the 80s or B television stars from the 80s. I'm like, well, good luck, right? And then a bunch of people are like, oh, that's me. They raise their hand and they
Oh
submit
man.
themselves to the podcast. So yeah, it's really fascinating. And we saw this, you're an early blogger. We saw this with blogs as well.
Mhm.
There's a blog and web content covering every imaginable topic. And podcasting's not there yet. There are technically millions of podcasts out there, but the active number of podcasts is somewhere, depending on who you talk to, between 300,000 and 700,000. So it's a
Okay.
much smaller space.
Hmm.
But there's still a great diversity and thoughts and conversations out there in podcasting.
Yeah, I really think that as I listen to more podcasts, and I don't listen to as many as I'd like to because I just don't have the time. I'm not one of those that takes my earbuds on my walk with the dog.
Mm,
My husband and I walk the dog. We actually talk to each other. But
imagine that.
imagine that. But I do believe that the podcasts that are out there provide that, you said, that kind of connection. There's a more of a feeling connected than with a blog, because you're hearing the person's voice.
Yes, and it's longer format, right? When you read a
Yes.
blog post, it's usually a few minutes, right? As opposed to say a 30 to 60-minute in-depth conversation. So I refer to it as a more intimate medium
Yeah.
than a blog. It's still on demand. So it's not like radio or TV where, I mean, a news show, for example, you kind of have to listen to it or watch it when it happens.
Mhm.
Whereas podcasts are still on demand. So even if you don't listen to it when you're walking the dog, if you do commute, which I know fewer people do than they used to, you can
Mhm.
listen on the way there. You can listen when you're out for a run, when you're working out, those sorts of things as well.
Yeah, I think that's really the things that I hear, that because I've asked people, so what is it about podcasts that attracts you? And the majority of people say they can listen to them anywhere, that it's something that they can control, to your point. They don't have to be
Right.
in front of the TV at the 6 o'clock news. So one of the things that you and I kind of exchanged in our emails, exchange information about, is the fact that, excuse me, oh, more tea. Podcasts can be really valuable to authors.
Yes.
Talk about
Yes.
that a little.
Yeah, so I found a lot of authors using podcastguests.com to talk about their book and their topic to grow their audience. In fact, I work with a publishing house that features a lot of their podcasts on the service. And so when you think about it, especially when a new book comes out, you're doing a lot of promotion. You used to, if you really did well, you could get booked on some radio shows and some TV shows to talk about your book. You might get a few interviews with blogs and publications, that sort of thing. Podcasting opens up a whole new realm there and a whole new marketing avenue. And I think podcasters like to have authors on their show because if someone can write an entire book about a topic, that means that they really know the topic, right? So it's kind of a first threshold. Hey, this person knows their stuff and they're dedicated to it. Of course, I'm mostly talking about nonfiction here. Of course, there are also avenues for fiction authors
Sure.
and podcasts as well. But so I find that in general, podcasters are really receptive to having authors on their show. And it's also, yes, as an author, you're kind of pitching your book, but you're not putting a hard sell on other things. And so I think one knock sometimes when people have guests on their show is that they're just there to pitch a product, right? Or a service, whereas no one minds if an author is pitching their book, right? So
Well, the difference is, what I tell my authors is, you're not there so much to pitch your book as to tell the story. And
right.
part of that story is you.
Mhm.
People want to know you, the author, and where else can they have that happen? It's this is unique, I think, in the last. So my experience for you is, I was a print-on-demand publisher back in 2005. And so I know the publishing world quite well. And in the end, it's always been a, like, maybe you got to see the author at a book signing if they were in your town and you were lucky and you sat in the back row or something. But very rarely do you actually get to listen to them, maybe respond to them, maybe connect with them. And podcasting lets you do that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Yvonne.
I mean, and to your point, what I'd love to have you expound on is, so if the author has a podcast. Do you know authors who have podcasts? Because I'd like to hear more about that.
Sure. So I think so. The first thing to understand and to think about as an author is there's being a guest and then there's hosting a podcast, and the level of responsibility between the two is dramatically different. So it's a lot more work to host a podcast, because when we're done today, you might do some light editing. You've got to get it ready. You've got to put it online. You have to promote it. And as a guest, when we're done today, the only thing I have to do afterward is kind of promote it to my audience after you publish it, right? There's preparing for the interview, which you also have to do as a guest, but you kind of get used to what the questions are, that sort of thing. I would just say there's a lot more that goes into being a podcaster. So if I were an author before starting my own podcast, I'd first go be a guest on some and see if I like it, see if it's something that resonates with me, and then say, would I feel comfortable doing this on a regular basis? Because that's something that podcast listeners want. They want, okay, this podcast comes out on Mondays at 10:30 a.m., something along those lines. So I can listen on Monday afternoon on my commute, something along those lines. So that's a lot more work, but the rewards can be significantly higher. And so when you think about having a podcast, and let's say you get a couple hundred listeners every week, that's kind of like speaking in front of an auditorium of a couple hundred people every week, which is pretty cool. And so what you can talk about your experience, right, and grow your audience. And people that are listening and are part of your audience, part of your fan base over time, are more likely to buy your books, share them with friends, and thereby help you as an author.
Yeah. And that's the other thing is I tell my authors that, again, go back to the story, not just the story of the book. People want that like behind the scenes look about how you struggled with chapter 2 or how there's a chapter that you took out or things like that. Come up with some unique. When I work with my authors, I actually say to them, there are some things that you will put in the book that I'm going to make you take out, because you need something to talk about when you're on a podcast or you're in front of an audience. And it needs to be things that aren't necessarily in the book.
Right. So it's the story behind it, right? In fascinating, just authors who want to know the back, and people know, and
So you
movie
broke up
stars.
for a minute. You broke up for a minute. Back up and say.
Sure. So, it's the story behind the story. I
Yes.
think we all want to know that. And that's not just books, right? We all want to know the backstory behind entrepreneurs or TV stars, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's what I see. I see a lot of that when I look at the list that you put out for everyone. By the way, podcastguests.com. Again, folks, you need to go look it up and join and become a member. And but I do see it's one of the things that people should understand is getting on a podcast. It takes a little work. I mean, the podcast owner, the podcast person putting the podcast out, they want credible guests. They want people who are actually going to speak, and not like, I'll admit, I've had a couple of guests on my show here where every answer to every question was yes. And it's like, could we hear a little more about that, please? So podcasts often vet their guests. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think podcasters vet them in a few different ways. So we talked earlier, if you have a book that's good, it knows your subject matter, but it doesn't tell me that you can talk about it, that you can speak, right? Maybe you can write about it, but you can't speak. And so first of all, it helps to be on some other podcasts, right? So that I as a podcaster can go listen to some, or if you have any YouTube videos or anything like that, I can, even if I listen for a minute or two, I get an idea on how you will do as a guest on a show. And I'll say that a lot of people, we all get butterflies in our stomach when we go speak in front of an audience on a stage, right? That's perfectly natural. I tell people that it's natural to be nervous at first about being on podcasts as well, but it's a lot, it should be a lot less nerve-wracking for a number of reasons. First of all, it's not live, right? If I really messed up now, you could go in and edit it, right? And some of them are video like this one, but a lot of them are audio only. So you don't even have to worry about how you look and how you look on screen, right? And then, there's radio, which is live, similar, but it's live. And then there's TV, which is, oh my gosh, it's visual and auditory and it's live. And then there's speaking in front of an audience, right? So of all of these things, with the exception of perhaps writing, although a lot of people get nervous about that, podcasting is kind of the easiest way to get into media, right? Into these types of avenues for marketing. And you'll get a lot more comfortable over time doing it. Right. And so getting on that first podcast or two, improving how you speak, how you answer questions, that sort of thing is really a key there. And then once you get one or two good ones that you're happy with, you can include links to those in what we called your one sheet, kind of the profile that you give to people. I'm sure authors have something similar, even for not getting on podcasts. And so, those sorts of things then help a podcaster vet. Another thing a podcaster wants to see, they want to know that you'll help promote the show after you're on it. Yeah. And so even if you don't have a big audience on social media, that sort of thing, they want to know that you'll tweet about it or put it on Facebook or Instagram or whatever your main social media platform is. And so that's your main job after you're on a show. And so I always tell people to go ahead and say what you're willing to do ahead of time, because that'll get the podcaster excited. The podcaster, one of the reasons they have good guests on their show, other than to provide good content, is they also want someone to expand their own audience, right? And so if I have an author on, if that audience then listens to that guest on my show and they're like, hey, this show is interesting, then hopefully they'll hit the subscribe button and listen to more of my podcasts as well.
Yeah, I really like the way you put that. And this is really relevant. Most of the authors I work with are nonfiction. And one of the things that they come to me with is, because I have a very long vetting process. And one of the things is they want to speak. They want to become public speakers. They don't just want to write the book and then sit back and wait for sales to come in. And that, of course, is huge, because I tell them all the time, you're not going to get rich on this book. But so the speaking part, this podcasts are a great place to start honing your message and your story. And I have an author I'm working with now where he told me a particular personal story about growing up that I said, why is this not in the book? This is one in the book, and this is going to be your signature story. You are going to lead with this story when you are on guest shows, because this is going to immediately grab people's attention and get them listening carefully to what you say. So the whole idea of becoming a public speaker can start with podcasting.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of a lower risk type way to get into it, right? So that when you do finally get on stage, you're more comfortable.
Yeah, because you've done it. You've learned how to, like you just said, build the one sheet. I help them, but they can learn on their own how to hone their message, what stories they're going to tell, because again, it goes back to engaging the audience. And I love that podcast. One of the things that you said earlier, and I raised my hand for it, because if it's an audio podcast, it doesn't matter what you look like. You don't have to get all fancied up for it. But in the end, this is a promotional tool for both the podcaster and the guest. And the more that the guest understands that, the better guests they are and the more podcasts they'll be on. You think?
Yes, as long as they don't overdo it, right? And so one of the challenges, I think, is a lot of guests go on and their primary goal is to promote their product or service rather than to educate. So I always tell people your number one goal is to educate that audience about the topic. Or in the case of if you are kind of the topic as an author, your personal stories, that sort of thing, as opposed to sell, right? And so one of the things is, if you are the type of guest that just sells, right? You're just going on there to do your own version of an ad. You certainly won't get invited back onto that podcast a second time. And if anyone listens to that, they're not going to invite you on their show either. Right. And so the guests that I've seen that get invited repeat on the same show and onto more shows are the ones that really have a good message, and they're educating the audience, they're delighting the audience, they're entertaining the audience, as opposed to ones that are on there just to pitch themselves or their product.
Right, right. I really feel strongly that the more you give away, the more you get back.
Yes.
And I mean, I have back in the day, I don't know if you know, but there were authors who wrote entire books on their blog, and they published it and people bought it because the interaction and the engagement on the blog helped them improve the actual written book. So
Mhm.
the book on the blog was similar, but not the same as the book that was published. And it's the same with podcasting. You give away as much as you can. You're never going to regret, unless you're a fiction author, you don't want to give away the ending of the book. But, for nonfiction, you definitely want to, as you said, focus on the message, focus on the story, focus on the behind the scene, peek behind the scenes. So what kind of podcast do you get invited on besides ones like this?
Yeah, there's a lot of variety because everyone wants to talk about podcasting. And a lot
Yeah.
of times I'll get invited onto a show to talk about podcasting. And then they'll be like, wait, you know about domain names? And then the show kind of devolves into that because everyone's got their story about, oh, I've got a lot of domain names from this or that. So,
Mhm.
but yeah, so authors, technical blogs, a lot of business because people are trying to figure out how do I use podcasting in my business or
Sure.
my marketing, and how do I do that smartly? Because we've seen a lot of people just say, oh, we need a podcast, right? Or their CEO says, oh, we need a podcast. Everyone's doing this, right? And it's like, okay, where do we start? So I end up being on a wide variety of podcasts. And although I primarily talk about podcasting on
Mhm.
podcasts,
Mhm.
we do sometimes go into some other areas such as domain names.
Well, so when you're on shows and you do talk about podcasts, what are like 5 things or 3 things that you would tell someone before starting their podcast?
Well, so one of them is what I mentioned earlier, which is be a guest first. Make sure that you're okay with that. If you don't enjoy doing that, then you're going to hate being a host, right? Because
Mm.
as I mentioned, it's a lot more work. Um, the other thing is to make sure you understand what your goal is in doing that podcast. So I think a lot of people start a podcast and they're like, I'm going to be the next Joe Rogan and I'm going to have millions of downloads and I'm going to sell to Spotify or sell ads, which is the most
Mhm.
common thing. People are like, oh, I'm going to sell ads and
Mhm.
I'm going to make money from that. Odds are you aren't. The median number of downloads per episode across all podcasts is fewer than 200. And that's a small audience to sell ads against. But there can be other value from it, right? And so one of the biggest value points you get out of being a podcast host is the opportunity to have these one-on-one conversations with people. And so, if I call someone up out of the blue and say, I want to talk to you for half an hour and learn from you, they're gonna be like, who are you? Why am I spending a half hour with you? But if I say, hey, I'd like to introduce you to my podcast audience and have you talk to them about X, Y, and Z, then it's really interesting, right? And it's really compelling. So I think through what you want to get out of it. And if it's to grow your own personal brand and to educate your audience and have these one-on-one conversations, I think that's a great reason to start a podcast. If your primary goal is just to sell ads and make money directly from the podcast itself, you're probably going to end up being disappointed. So I tell people that ahead of getting started with their own show. And then, one thing I tell people is once they get over that hump, once they decide they want to do a podcast, it's just do it, right? Your first few episodes might not be very good, but I see people and from personal experience, when I started mine, and let's see, I'm up to episode 370. So we're talking like
Wow.
6 years ago, I researched everything. I was like, okay, I need the right mic. I need the right setup in my room. I need everything to be perfect. And that delayed getting out there for a few months. And so I see people too that like they do 20 interviews before they even publish a show. So they don't get feedback until they're doing like the 21st episode, right? They don't get
Wow.
feedback from their audience and what their audience wants. So I always tell people, get out there, put it out there, even if it's not a perfect product, and you'll improve it over time. And perfection is the enemy of progress, right? And I think that's
Mhm.
very much true with podcasting.
Yeah, yeah. You have to ship, folks.
Yeah, yeah,
That's,
you do.
that's
I'm sure with authors that's a particularly big deal because they go over it and over it before
yes.
they actually publish the book.
Yes, there's like 200 things they think need to be done before the book
Right.
can come out. And it's like you just said, put the book out, and you can fix the next book.
Right.
You can take what you learned from the first book, but people want to see that. They want to see you. They want you to take that step. So then the other question is, if I want to start a podcast, I'm an author and I've taken your lessons. I'm not going to have this podcast just to market my book so I get rich and famous. And by the way, when you were speaking about 200 downloads and whatnot, the average author sells about 250 books.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, so that's the average overall publishing, because generally speaking, the author's in charge of marketing the book, regardless of who publishes it.
Right.
If you go to a traditional publisher, they still want you to market the book.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm going to do this, Andrew, do I choose my name as the domain name for my podcast, or how do I name my podcast?
So naming your show, that's an interesting topic, and it gets to discovery a podcast. So right now, discovery of podcasts is very weak. Like on Apple, if you search in their app, you're searching the title and the author name, right? They aren't searching within the shows or even the show topics as of today, or at least as of a month ago. I'm sure that could change. So that discovery is really challenging. So your title and the author name are really important there. And I've seen people take a lot of different approaches to this. There's, you can put your name in it if you're trying to brand about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
If you're speaking about a specific topic over and over, I think it's good to use that topic as the name. And then you can always put by so-and-so in there, just like you would a book as well.
Okay.
Some of the people that I've seen have the best success have the podcast title explains clearly what the podcast is about. I know someone who I think the name of the podcast is something like Things Entrepreneurs Do or something like that. And so people are like, oh, okay, I get exactly what this podcast is about. So that's an approach you can take as well. Now, for a lot of people, growing their audience, they're not going to depend on Apple Podcasts to, because the discoverability is so bad. So if you're branding around yourself, it might make perfect sense to use your name there. I see that a lot. I had a couple of podcasts we featured in the newsletter that went out today where the people were like, the John Smith Experience, the Susan Smith Show, that sort of thing. And that's okay. You're branding around yourself. As a listener, unless I know who you are, I'm like, well, I don't care. Listen to that show.
Yeah, but for authors, I tell them all the time that they are selling themselves. If they're going to write more than one book, then they want people to recognize their name. And generally for nonfiction, they want the company name or something like that. So I like your idea of what is the message that you're sharing that can go across all the books that you're planning to write, that goes across the business that you're running, that people will recognize.
Right.
And for fiction authors, I think that's a little trickier. But
you almost have to go more around your genre or your name. And the nice thing is you can do both, right? You can do Cool Things Authors Do by Yvonne DeVita. That's sort of thing, right? And that can be your title. You can put your image on the cover art if you want. One thing I do recommend, I did say earlier, just go out there, get your podcast out there. I do recommend spending a little bit of money on getting good cover art. And this, authors should appreciate this, right? You wouldn't spend years writing a good book and then put a bad cover on it. Same thing with a podcast. And as people are scrolling through their podcast app, what do they see? They see this image, a small image, by the way. So it's got to really stand out even when it's small. And that's what they're judging you by. So if that's not good, they are judging the book by its cover, at least initially. So I would spend some time. I wouldn't just outsource that to someone on Fiverr unless they're really good. I would hire a graphic artist who specializes in podcast image art.
That's interesting, and that's very powerful because it's absolutely true. The authors especially need good headshots. I mean, because they're going to use that material, not just for the podcast, but on other social channels. They should be able to have really good images and artwork. And then I mean, that also then begins to help people who are looking and searching podcasts and finding you. It helps them identify you going forward.
Right.
So yeah, I love the way that podcast guests actually, how do you choose what goes in each newsletter you send out?
So like which podcast we feature
Yeah,
or
which podcasts, and so you have podcasts that are looking for guests, and you have podcasts that you can be a guest on.
Right. So there are two sections to the newsletter. So we send these out twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays, and each one has 10 podcasts that are looking for guests. And so for those, what we do is we say, here's the podcast, here's what they're looking for, and then you can click a link to learn a little bit more, to go, see their Apple Podcast link if you want to listen to an episode, and then you pitch yourself to that person. And those podcasts are ones that submit themselves to us saying, hey, I want to be included. And we have some minimum qualifications. They have to have at least 10 published episodes at the time. They need to tell us that they don't charge guests to appear, that sort of thing. But by and large, we want a diversity of podcast opinion sizes, that sort of thing. So they all get in. Then we include some of the experts that are in our directory. So we have a directory, and this is a paid side of the business. The rest of it's free, where you, let's say as an author, you want to get booked on shows, and you can pitch for free through the podcast in our newsletter. But if you want podcasters to be able to come to you, then you can create this online one sheet, this profile. And so we take 15 of the people in that directory each week that have the premium level membership, which is our more expensive one, and put them in the newsletter. And so that gives them a little bit more exposure as well. And it tends to drive a lot of invitations if they've done a good job creating their profile, right? And so it's just more exposure, more discoverability than just being in the directory.
And that's really, really cool. You said something really interesting. So people shouldn't pay to be on podcasts?
No, because if you pay to be on a podcast, technically in the US, that podcaster has to disclose that you paid. And all of a sudden you're looking at an infomercial, and people aren't really going to be listening to it. And that sort of thing. So yeah, that's one of the key things. Now, there are some shows, I guess, that would pay guests, but I think you'd have to be pretty famous, for them to pay you. But yeah, I would never pay to be a guest on a podcast.
Excellent. Well, we're at the end of our time here, and this has been really, really fantastic, because there is so much opportunity for authors to either start their own podcast using your advice, or joining podcastguests.com and finding podcasts to be on, and finding the right podcast to be on. I mean, that's the other thing, Andrew, is that people don't necessarily know, especially new authors. So someone who this is their first book, for instance, I don't know what show do I be on? How do I do this? So there's opportunity out there for them to join podcastguests.com, and it actually helps educate them. I think the way you do the newsletter and the way you have the site and everything, it's very helpful for people to kind of get their heads around what this thing is that they're so they're attracted to, but they're still afraid of.
Yeah, I mean, you want to imitate what other people are doing that are having success with it, right? And so, looking at these different profiles and ones that really speak to you, and how they're set up, I think that's a good thing for you to think about when you want to set up your profile to be a guest.
Yep, imitation is the highest form of flattery, isn't that true? Well, this has been really, really helpful, and I can't wait to be able to share this and share podcastguests.com. And if I get a lot of questions or whatever, maybe we'll have to do this again.
Sure.
But this is something I hope that people who watch and find and even listen to can get their head around the fact that it's not the new shiny thing anymore. It's actually established now. Podcasting is something that you can do or you can be a guest on, but it doesn't mean that it's easy.
Right. There is a lot of work that goes into it. You need to prepare as a guest. You need to prepare as a host. I put together there's a free guide on podcastguests.com for being a guest, right? And so it kind of walks through what you need to do from a technical standpoint, preparation standpoint, and what you need to do after the show as well. You can get that at podcastguests.com/guide. You don't even have to give me your email address or anything. You can just download it. And I think that's a good starting place for people who are just trying to get their heads around this to think about what's involved.
I think it's awesome. And by the way, folks, you might want to start finding podcasts if you're in business and thinking about writing a book. You don't have to have the book. You can start being on podcasts and talk about why you're writing the book, what the book's going to be about, and that's your pre-marketing, folks.
Excellent point.
So, so Andrew, thank you so much for being on the show today, and I will get this up probably next Wednesday, and I look forward to more of the great content I see on podcastguests.com.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me.